Having that perspective allows you to see Earth for what it is. It's one body. We're all in this together.
The Interplanetary Podcast. The exploration of space for the benefit of all mankind. Your hosts here in London, Matthew Russell and Jamie Franklin.
Oh, yeah, baby Jessica Watkins.
Jessica Watkins.
Jamie.
Hello, Matt.
Yeah, Jamie, before we do our greetings to one another.
Oh, yeah.
Did you think that was a good impression of Jessica Watkins?
Well, I thought we've been doing the posh voices for a while now.
That's true. We need to mix it up.
I thought I'd mix it up. Absolutely no offence, Jessica, because, I mean, she's ace. She definitely doesn't sound like that.
I liked this little interview that there was in Nature. Jessica Watkins, who is potentially going to be the first human to walk on Mars. Wouldn't that be exciting?
I mean, how insane is that, even thinking about that?
Yeah, so she got a PhD studying landslides on Mars, and now she's a NASA astronaut. She's one of the sort of fresh batch of astronauts. So she might be. She's only 32 or something daft, and she's already achieved about 20 orders of magnitude more than I did with my life.
I mean, come on, was she in a band called Broadsword?
She wasn't in a band, no.
So.
That's the only downside about reading about asteroids. Sometimes it can make you feel a little bit inferior.
Yeah,
but you're right. She wasn't in a band, although she probably was. That's the annoying thing. I bet she was in a band at college, and she was like an ace bang out drummer. Or
they charted.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. It's just sort of really annoying.
So there we go. That's the question of the day. Does anyone know? Was Jessica in a band?
Well, maybe Jessica would like to come on the Interplanetary podcast and tell her.
Oh, I'd love that. If she does, I'm really sorry about the accent I just put on. It's just a joke.
She might have found it either hilarious or deeply insulting. Jamie, we have Nicholas Booth on today.
Nicholas Booth
as a guest. And I'll tell you a little funny story. I was walking in Ilfracombe the other day, a tiny little seaside village, if people don't know it.
It's a beauty.
And there was a box at the side of the road saying, "Take any book you want." And in the box was a book called Race to Mars. And guess who it's written by?
Not Nicholas
It's
Booth.
written by Nicholas Booth. So I picked it up and I thought, that's very funny, because I was talking to Nicholas that day about doing this very podcast. So I instantly sent him a picture and it made him laugh. So yes, Nicholas Booth has been writing about space and Mars for a very long time and is a super cool chap, and we've been having lots of fun on Twitter, etc. So this is going to be a great interview.
Oh, that is ace.
Right.
Well, we look forward to that.
Yeah. Before we go any further, Jamie, a little bit of a sad one.
Oh, God. Go on.
So, this week, John Glenn's wife, Annie Glenn, has died at the age of 100 from COVID-19, it would seem. Complications.
That is sad.
Yeah, she was...
Oh, rest in peace. But I tell you what an innings.
Yeah, getting to 100, and she apparently had like overcame a significant speech impediment and was a sort of very well-known advocate for helping others with similar challenges. So an amazing person, and what that's very sad, but also get to 100 and you've really done an amazing job. I wonder if she the only problem in America is you don't get a letter from the Queen.
What?
Yeah,
really?
You don't get a letter from the Queen. She'd been...
Well, maybe we should...
That's a point.
We should start sending letters.
That's a point. That's a very good... You get a letter from the Interplanetary podcast if you are related to space and you are over 100. I think that's a very good idea. I wonder if Canadians get a letter from the Queen when they get to 100. I would imagine they do. Anyway, we'll have to ask Jake one day. The big news story this week, though, Jamie, which was which is quite incredible. The Ken Bowersox has had to take over. The former space shuttle commander, Ken Bowersox, that is, has had to take over from Douglas Lavero, because he just suddenly resigned from his new role as the chief of human exploration. So he's only just got that. He's only just got that job in that reshuffle a few months ago. It was only 8 days away from the return of US human spaceflight. So he's resigned at this absolutely crazy time. Yeah, it was all a bit of a whoa. What's happened there?
Well, there's only one person you can go to in these times.
Exactly,
and that's Mr. Berger.
Mr. Berger. And I also had a quick little conflab with David Baker. So Eric Berger in Ars Technica had this kind of. He laid it out. Basically, it's Lavero resigned because he's kind of mucked up the procurement process for the lunar landers that we talked about with Jake and Anthony.
Yeah.
He essentially thinks that the only way to get to land on the moon by 2024 would be to have an integrated system that you launch on SLS. Whereas all the other ones, you kind of have to do a little bit of assembly in space, as far as I'm aware.
That's right.
So he kind of said to Boeing, you really need to get your bid sorted out because it's a really strong bid. But Boeing never made it through the initial stage of procurement. They got rejected pretty much immediately. So he's kind of broken the rules, though. You're not really supposed to do that. It doesn't seem like he's broken the rules maliciously and was getting backhanders from Boeing or from some senator where Boeing is based or whatever. So no, but he's breaking the rules. So he's had to resign and he's gone.
God damn, get out of here.
David Baker agreed with Eric Berger's assessment there as well. So it's a pretty odd story.
Yeah, it's not good, is it?
Especially considering on the 27th of May, this week now, we have the big one.
Oh,
so,
are you gonna wake a dragon?
Awaken the dragon.
Awaken the beast.
Crew Dragon Demo 2. Yeah, this is the return of US spaceflight. US human spaceflight, which is, let's face it, extremely long overdue. I was thinking about this the other day. Imagine saying to Neil Armstrong when he got back from the moon, or worse, Buzz Aldrin. Imagine saying to one of those when they got back safely in 1969 and turned round to them and said, "Do you know what? In the year, from the year 2012 till 2020, we won't be able to send people into space. The Americans won't be able to send people into space. And do you know what's worse? We'll be paying the Russians to do it for us."
Oh my God. It would just be unthinkable, wouldn't it?
It's just actually
unthinkable.
I mean, it's actually incredible. So this does, I must admit, it might be hard for us as English people to really appreciate what this means.
Yeah.
But the fact that point that you brought up, the fact that people can't travel down to the Cape and actually see what is a monumental launch, really, is really quite depressing, isn't it? But I shall be watching it online. Just like everything else, I'm watching my friends online. News. I'm watching my TV. Basically, very little these days I don't do through a tiny little hole on a computer screen. It's very annoying.
Oh, thank goodness for the internet.
Oh my God. I'm not sure. I wonder what our lives would be like without it. I don't know. It'd be probably very depressing, wouldn't it? Yes, Doug Chunky Hurley, as he's called. Oh, Chunky.
Oh, Doug, Chunky.
Chunky. Yes, he was the pilot on the very last SDS-135 back in 2011. So he was the last person to fly an American mission, and he's going to be the first to fly when it comes back. So that's pretty cool. Nice little circle complete there.
That is cool. Welcome back, Chunky.
Yeah, he's donned his SpaceX pressure suit, which does actually make him look a little bit chunky, a little bit middle-aged, as previously discussed.
Don Le Chunk.
Dr. Bob Behnken is going to be the person that joins him. Oh, now, here's a coincidence. He's the veteran of 2 space shuttle flights as well. Now, here's a coincidence. They are both married to other astronauts. So Bob is married to Megan MacArthur, who was the very last person, this is a very cool claim to fame, the last person to touch the Hubble Space Telescope.
That is pretty
That
cool.
is really cool, isn't it? So she was on that very last servicing mission, and she was the last person to touch it. That is really cool.
Yeah.
Whereas Commander Chunky, is married to Karen Nyberg, who's one of the super cool NASA astronauts, and her nephew Andrew designed the insignia for the launch.
Bloody hell! What a family.
Yeah, that's a bit painful, isn't it? Karen Nyberg, of course, she was on the International Space Station, even though she had a young child with Bob, who I believe was serving as the sort of chief of the astronaut office or something crazy. So they're busy people, and they still manage to have a kid and
really
bring it
are.
up while one's in space.
Easy.
Easy peasy. So of course we've discussed the fact that this mission will have NASA Worm on it for the first time since
Return of the Worm.
You know that it'll be back. If only Worm rhymed with back.
I
wonder
know.
if it rhymes
Damn
with
it.
something.
Return of the Worm. You know it's gonna burn.
Great. Return of the Worm. It's got a re-entry burn.
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. We finally got there.
There we go. That's the hit.
There's going to be a nice fresh booster that's going to land on Of Course I Still Love You in the Atlantic.
Excellent.
I think we should come up with different ways of saying Of Course I Still Love You. About Of Course I Still Love You.
That's very James Bond.
Of course I still love you.
Oh, yes. I think it's my favourite impression that you do.
Oh, yes, of course I still love you.
Of course.
Hey, Crew Dragon
Yeah.
is now the only manned capsule to land at sea, which is very odd considering about like 3 or 4 years ago it was all about how it was going to land with its retro rockets on the ground and it was all going to be like super cool. No, it's just going to splash down in the sea and the astronauts are going to have to be recovered. So yeah, that's the first time since the Apollo era, as far as I'm aware, that's that sea recovery, getting astronauts out of a capsule before it sinks, is first time that's happened since Gene Cernan splashed down. I think
This is the thing. I
think an exciting one for Britain though. This week.
Here we go.
So, UK-based rocket company Skyrora,
who
are the sort of enfant terrible of British rocket companies, as far as I can make out. They're the rogues. They actually managed to set up a mobile launch complex, which is harder than you think. It's got like these lots and lots of trucks with various command centers and stuff like that in them and fueling things. They set that up in 5 days in COVID-19 lockdown conditions, no less. And they have done a full static fire test with their Skylark L rocket. Now, they're saying that is the first since, on UK soil, the first since the UK Black Arrow programme, which was 50 years ago, of course. So, yeah, that's pretty monumental.
That's amazing.
Which means that they're now confident they're going to have a Skylark L launch from a British spaceport by as early as next spring.
That is class.
That's very cool. So that's... the Skylark
looks like we're going back to Scotland, Matt.
Yeah, we'll have to go see that launch. A Skylark L is only a sort of 2.5 ton rocket, and it's only capable of getting just about into space. So it puts a 50 kilogram object to a height of about 102 kilometers. So it just gets into space. Useful for research, for universities and research facilities and things like that. But yeah, it's a single stage. It's just one single stage suborbital rocket. But the Skyrora XL, they reckon, is going to be ready to fly in 2023, and that's a proper, launching 315 kilograms or so into low Earth orbit.
Jeez Louise.
Yeah, so that is quite an interesting story. Skyrora's chief executive officer, the CEO.
Shall I tell you what he said?
Vladimir Levkins. What did he say?
As the launch aspect of the UK's new space industry starts to emerge, there will be many events that have never happened here previously, and this is one of them. This was a mammoth effort in very trying circumstances, so it is quite an achievement to be proud of. Check it out.
Beautiful. So yes, Skyroar are definitely a company to watch, aren't they? Well, there's a quite.
I think we should try and get one of them on the line. Get a nice little interview.
So if you're listening, Skyroar, I know you are. Come on, and
Yes, they are.
I'll email you later on. So you'll probably get the email before you listen to this. A very cool one. Ariane, ESA have allowed Kerbal space enthusiasts to be able to build the Ariane 5 rocket and tackle real ESA missions. From
nuts.
1st of July, they're going to release Shared Horizons. And so, so if you're a Kerbal fan and you're an ESA fan, 1st of July, you should be in some form of heaven.
There we go.
Old Henry Philp, who'll be very pleased with that one.
Very pleased indeed.
Henry writes a little Kerbal Space Program article each month in Spaceflight magazine.
Oh, you've got to pick up a copy.
Jamie, this is a great one.
Here we go.
There is a space telescope that has been called W-FIRST for a while.
Uh-huh.
And W-FIRST is the next kind of generation space telescope. It's one of the ones that always there's a threat of its budget being removed. So it lives in that kind of really perilous zone that it could have its funding cut at any time. But it does seem to have had the green light, and it's getting closer and closer to being a super reality. Now,
here we go.
Remember talking about Nancy Grace Roman?
Oh, NGR, yeah.
NGR on podcast 133. Lovely to go back and listen to that again, because Nancy is a total legend.
She really is.
Mother of Hubble, the telescope, not the man. She was really super instrumental in making Hubble Space Telescope happen. So this is really, really cool. They've decided to call this W-FIRST Next Generation Space Telescope the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope.
That's awesome.
Yes, so
that is awesome.
Yeah, and of course it's the 100th year of women's suffrage, so as well. So it's actually NASA have used that moment to use Nancy to name this space telescope. Which
well done, NASA.
And yeah, I didn't realise that it's got exactly the same sized mirror as Hubble. But because because the technology is slightly better, it can take pictures at the same resolution as Hubble, but the field of view is 100 times larger. So every picture that W-FIRST take is like 100 pictures that Hubble takes, which means, of course, it can survey the sky a lot quicker and well, there's going to be 100 times more data. So this is great news for scientists and great news for fans of beautiful pictures of space.
Oh, that is so exciting.
Do you want to hear what former Senator Barbara Mikulski, who also worked on the Hubble Space Telescope and the W-FIRST Space Telescope, did you hear what she said?
Senator Babs? Yeah, go for it.
Former Senator Babs. She said,
"It is well deserved. It recognizes the incredible achievements of women in science and moves us even closer to no more hidden figures and no more hidden galaxies."
Clever, huh?
Real good. Real good.
Referencing the hidden figures of NASA's women that helped the Apollo mission and tying that in with hidden galaxies. How cool is that?
Absolutely lovely. Good work, Babs.
Good work, Babs. So just a quick rundown of the Roman Space Telescope, as it now is called. It's got a 2.4 primary mirror, 2.4 meter primary mirror. That's almost 8 feet in diameter. So about the same
Nice.
size as Hubble, or exactly the same size as Hubble. And it's got two instruments. The Wide Field instrument, which of course is where the WFIRST name came from, the Wide Field Instrument Space Telescope, which obviously is this Hubble camera that's able to take even wider field than the Hubble could. But it's also got this sort of next generation coronagraph. And a coronagraph is this thing that blocks out the light of a star so that you can see planets orbiting the star. You know, like sometimes where something's really bright and you put your hand and it kind of blocks that light, and you can see things in the glare.
Oh, right.
It's like that. So it's like a
yeah.
coronagraph that does that. So it'd be able to see things like a kind of Uranus. I'd try to avoid it. Uranus-sized planet orbiting about the distance that Earth is from the sun. It can just about spot and actually view that sized planet. So it's going to be able to get pictures of, well, you know, get data of large planets orbiting stars. So that's going to be, it's going to be actually amazing. Well, WFIRST is going to be very, very cool. So
that's so exciting.
Yeah,
Get in.
It's getting closer and closer to being a reality.
It will probably be up before James Webb.
Oh, yeah. Ooh.
Let's not talk about that.
But the two combined, that's the really exciting thing. WFIRST and James Webb combined will really be something very, very special indeed.
This is it.
So have you heard about this Outer Space Treaty, Jamie?
OST? Yeah, big time.
There's a kind of new one called the Artemis Accords.
Uh-huh.
Which is essentially NASA's outlining a certain set of values that they want to take to the moon. And it's really kind of based on the Outer Space Treaty. I did spot that quite a few commentators were saying that really there's something in this, that using this, you know, it all looks totally agreeable. But in the Outer Space Treaty, there's this slightly contentious part of the Outer Space Treaty that says you can't own anything in space. So you're not allowed to land on the moon and stick your flag in and say, this belongs to me.
It's mine. It's the Interplanetary podcast.
Yeah, it's the Interplanetary podcast because we put our name on a little Mars rover. So you can't do that. But the Americans interpret it as well as saying, no, you can't own the place, but you can own the resources that you extract. Now, there's a little bit of ambiguity about that, but this Artemis Accords agreement perhaps makes that slightly less ambiguous, and therefore people agreeing to the Artemis Accords agreements are kind of nudging the Outer Space Treaty into the realm of course you can go and get resources and they're yours. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's interesting, and it was amazing how vocal Jim Bridenstine, he was talking to Ars Technica, and he was very vocal in relation to this about that last week's Long March 5B crashing down. And this is what he said, and I think this is actually amazing. He goes, the empty core stage of the Long March 5B, weighing nearly 20 tons, was in an uncontrolled free fall along a path that carried it over Los Angeles and over densely populated areas. I can think of no better example of why we need the Artemis Accords. It's vital for the US to lead and establish norms of behavior against such irresponsible activities. Space exploration should inspire hope and wonder, not fear and danger.
That's glory. Fair play.
He's not messing around there, is he? So that
go for it,
yeah,
Jim.
Go for it. That's pretty strong stuff. And it's basically saying, look, we're all going to go to the moon. Let's all sign up to this and have It's a good list. So it's on NASA's website, the Artemis Accords. I will stick it into the notes as well. It's quite cool though.
That's great.
It's all obvious stuff and it's all related to the Outer Space Treaty.
Yeah.
But it's quite good to see it written down. Let's hope that everyone sticks to it.
Fingers crossed.
What do you think of the chances?
Oh God, let's not.
Oh,
Very slim.
yes. There was a story on the ESA website that I really liked, really grabbed my attention. I'm kind of in the vibe now that I'm looking at things when people say, oh, it's going to be the end of the world type scenarios. There's going to be an asteroid strike. There's going to be this. There's going to be that. There's going to be a pandemic. And you go, yeah, whatever. But now we've had a pandemic or in a pandemic, I can kind of take these things slightly more seriously now. I don't know about you, but I saw one. And the headline was Earth's magnetic field is mysteriously weakening. And I thought, oh no, here we go. Can you imagine if suddenly
that's all we need?
If like, oh yeah, no, we've only got like 50 years before the Earth's magnetic field just goes and that's it. I mean, that really would be game over. So there are 3 satellites that are up that ESA put up called Swarm. And yes, they have. We talked about them back on podcast 131 when we talked about. Remember the atmospheric anomaly called Steve.
Oh, I do remember that.
So yes, Swarm actually cracked what Steve was, and it is very, and it, it's some kind of interaction with electricity and the solar storms with Earth's magnetic field. So that actually Swarm has been one thing when I was reading up about Swarm that I think is very interesting is that Canada had a satellite that they were using to do a similar sort of thing, and it just so happened that it matched the profile of Swarm's trio of satellites, and so they added this Canadian satellite. And this Canadian satellite is now part of a 4-satellite constellation of Swarm, and it became Echo. So you've got Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Echo flying around. And so the Canadians, sort of added this 4th satellite to the trio, which I thought was really interesting that you can kind of that it's that flexible up there. And it's but there is this spot that hangs over South America. And now it's stretching over to Africa, where the Earth's magnetic field is getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And it's almost like a sort of hole in the magnetic field. And it's known as the South Atlantic anomaly. And it's really but it's getting weaker, and no one really knows why. And some people have sort of speculated, well, maybe this is when the poles are just suddenly going to switch, because every now and then the poles switch, so south becomes north and north becomes south. A lot of people saying no, it's well within what you'd expect. So really, we're not really seeing a disaster here at all. But it's very, very interesting, and what it does affect this South Atlantic anomaly is spacecraft that fly over that area, because you've got this weakened sort of almost like a hole in the magnetosphere. Solar radiation just general radiation can pour in. It's not deflected by the magnetic field. So the spacecraft flying through that part affected quite badly by this radiation streaming in.
Sounds like a Hollywood movie waiting to happen, Matt.
It does. Well, that's what I thought. I thought that the South Atlantic anomaly getting bigger and bigger, and the Earth's magnetic field dying, and then you have to get Bruce Willis to drill into the core of the Earth to set off a nuclear explosion is literally what we need as the next Hollywood blockbuster, as far as I'm concerned.
Choose your protagonist, Matt. Who are we taking? So Bruce Willis?
We've definitely got Brucey bonus.
Tom Cruise or Clooney? Clooney's not much of an action one, though, is
Maybe he? Tom Cruise is stationed on the International Space Station, and that's what that's all about. And Bruce Willis, you could have all of them. You could have Arnie. What was the name of that franchise that we had for a bit, which had all of them in?
Oh God! What was that?
The Indestructibles or something. What were they called?
Oh my God! Yeah, I still haven't seen
that.
But
apparently they're really good. But
really,
yeah, apparently they are.
Let us know. Is that film any good?
Right, Jamie, we've rabbited on enough. Would you like to listen to Nicholas Booth?
Oh yes, please. It was so exciting. It made me sneeze.
A Kutai.
The Interplanetary Podcast, putting the ace back into space.
I am joined on the podcast with Nicholas Booth, who is a pretty prolific space author. Can I say that? Welcome.
You could have said that 20 years ago before I joined Witness Protection, because I've been doing other stuff. I turned to crime.
Well, you've got to do something in these journalistic hinterland. So I believe you've got a new book coming out. So let's start there. Let's give us a big rundown on this new book that's coming out, because it looks very exciting, and I've had the pleasure of having a little bit of a preview.
The book is called The Search for Life on Mars, the greatest scientific detective story of all time. And it's taken me 20 years to work that out with another author, a fabulous author who you should have on the podcast, Elizabeth Howell, who is Canadian and has lots of the energy that I once had. In the time we've finished the book, she's written another one and started another. I've been in the garden and, done a bit of cooking. So that just shows you, you said prolific. Well, I'm old. I'm in my 50s. So I wrote a few books a few years ago. But the book, basically, I started when I was in journalism. I worked in newspapers, and the most exciting night of my career was in 1996, when there were these strange rumours swirling around about, NASA had found something in this meteorite, and it's like something coming out of left field to do with Mars, which I can talk about. So I interviewed lots of people. I was in a very good position to be able to talk to people, and so from 96 to 99, 2000, that time period, I interviewed virtually everybody who was involved with Mars. And that was what I always called the second generation of researchers. The kind of first generation of people who built the first instruments that went to Mars, I'd spoken to most of those. So between us, we've both, as in Elizabeth and myself, have spoken to people over 30 years. And, being an anally retentive train spotter underneath it all, I kept all my notes.
So have you got like a sort of big, like a bunch of shoe boxes, essentially, full of...
Yeah, I kept notebooks, I kept taped interviews, not that anybody can play cassettes, anything that I saw that I thought was quite interesting, I kept. And the starting point for the book, oddly enough, was I'm not one for signs from the gods, but I was at my mum's house looking for something in her attic, and this box of discs literally landed on my head. And I looked and thought, oh, yes, that's all the Mars stuff that I was doing 20 years ago. And that was the same day, so this was in the summer of 2018, when the group of scientists at JPL, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, had published the first paper to say that the Curiosity rover, the big one with 6 wheels, had discovered for the first time organics on Mars. And that really was, that's really the starting point for the book, because when there were no organics discovered in 1976, all the scientists involved then said, game over. So 40 years later, here we are. And 40 years later, Curiosity finds organics on Mars, which was, it's a bit like a sort of mythical quest, really. And that was what they found. And the organics are the kind of biochemical backbone for life. And, it was a pretty significant discovery. And I thought, as soon as this wound on my head heals, I'll start working on the book. No, it wasn't that bad. I literally... and I was looking for a younger author, in the sense that I've been out of newspapers for over 20 years, and I'm not in any sense of the word current. And Elizabeth is very prolific, and she'd been to Baikonur and written about that. And it brought back some happy memories, because I'd been to Baikonur, which, if anybody is listening to this, if you ever get the chance to go to the Baikonur Cosmodrome, you should. That really is something out of Philip K. Dick. It is incredible.
Yeah, I saw it quite recently on that Netflix document. It was just crazy with all the kids playing on the model rockets. It's just like, wow.
You go there, and I mean, I've not been there since '94, so but it's still the same. You get to wander all over the launch pad when they're getting the rocket ready. Cape Canaveral, you're at least a mile away, and there's armed guards and marines. You don't get anywhere near. The thing that stuck in my memory is in the room next to where the cosmonauts suit up. So they stand up, they go through the ceremony, and they salute the motherland and do all that. There was a babushka. There was an old lady selling drinks, fizzy drinks, and this is absolutely true. So this was 94. State-of-the-art technology in the next room. This babushka is that using an abacus. There you go.
Really, really want to go to Baikonur, of course.
You should. I mean, you can do it now while you can, because we know SpaceX is going to launch soon. But if you can get the excuse to go there, it is extraordinary, and the sense of history. And one of the big regrets, unfortunately, is one of the things that we just did not have room for in the book was to look at all the Soviet missions, because that is an untold story, and unfortunately, for those of you who know the Soviet space history of all the missions that didn't quite work and everything that could have gone wrong went wrong, I do think that's one of the last great stories to be told. But what we've tried to do with the book is to make it as current as possible. So it comes out at the end of June in the US. Now, because of the virus that's taken over the world, I'm not sure when the clipper ships will get across the Atlantic to this side, but it will be available about the same time as the next launches. The NASA Perseverance, there's the Emirates Hope mission, and there's a Chinese mission as well. That it's the launch window, because as I'm sure some of you listeners know, you can't just, there's Mars, we'll go. You have to wait for the best opportunity with a launch window to open, so that you've got the right amount of fuel to get there. And as we know, it's not easy to get to Mars.
So you should have a pretty good gut feeling. What kind of gut feeling do you have with the chance of success of China's first stab at landing something on the surface?
I only can tell you what I've read and people we've spoken to, but what is really interesting about the Chinese program is it only really began in 2016. Now, they already landed the
Chang'e 4.
Chang'e, thank you very much, yeah. As I get older, I can't remember. On a good day, if you ask me my name, I can remember that. The Chinese, they've got their own sense of manifest destiny of what they want to do, and they're talking about that they may even attempt to bring samples of Mars back before the NASA ESA mission. But that also is the significant thing about these launches, particularly Perseverance, is the minute it goes, the clock is running, and that's the clock is running to bring back a sample of Mars. And I think that genuinely will be, certainly, it's probably the last great space spectacular I'll see in my lifetime, probably by the end of 2020s, early 2031, and that's it will be a shining moment of exploration. China could do it first. America could do it. I'm not a particularly betting man, but those samples will be returned, and I do think that, because again, we've spoken to all the people who are doing current Mars research, and a lot of them say that's the moment when we get this stuff back to our own labs, and we can do the work in our own labs, and we can that's when everything goes into overdrive. That's the moment in The Wizard of Oz where it goes from black and white to colour.
Rocks from Mars make their way over to Earth, and we occasionally get a little, we're able to do experiments on it. What is it about rocks that you could farm, you could send a little rover to collect and then get back, that would make them this extra special?
The problem with the rocks that land here, and the amazing thing is the estimate is about 0.5 ton. So 0.5 ton of Mars lands on Earth every year. Now, it doesn't all come at the same time in one big,
Which is lucky.
Because the place where you're most likely to find these things is Antarctica. And this really is the sort of the undercurrent of the story of the Martian meteorite in 1996. So the problem is with Martian meteorites, although they're really interesting, they're completely out of context. So you don't know where they've come from. It stands to reason that sometime in the ancient past, something has smashed into the surface of Mars, knocked these bits of rock off that have flown through, interplanetary space near to us, and then they sort of land, and then they land in Antarctica. But the only ones that survive are the kind of hard igneous rocks, in other words, the volcanic stuff, that we know by looking at Mars, because you can tell from, in the same way you look at on a winter's day and you see your other half go out to work and then the postman and then they come back and it snowed, you can tell by the, who's come in first sort of thing. Well, it's the same with craters on Mars. If you look across the northern hemisphere of Mars, it's mainly volcanic plains, and that means that there's not many craters there. So in other words, it's a younger surface. Now, the chances are that if life ever did get hold on Mars, it would be probably 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. The surfaces, excuse me, that we've seen, the volcanic rocks are somewhere between 2 to 3 billion. So you're not getting the sample that you need to find the interesting stuff. The rocks that tend to survive, that land here, that we get, tend to be younger than the interesting biochemistry that might have happened that you want to look for. So that, in a nutshell, is why you go and send a rover, because the rover can look and say, there's a rock, that looks interesting, let's go and have a look at it, do some basic chemistry, poke around with it, scratch it, move it, and see what you find, and then that's the sample that you bring back. And slightly more complicated than that, obviously, is the way that this will be done. Now, the NASA Perseverance rover is landing at a bullseye called Jezero, a crater on these older northern plains, but it looks as though, because it's a crater, that bedrock has been thrown out, and there's all these what they call ejector blocks, which is all the stuff that's thrown out of a crater impact, and that's the older stuff. So the plan is that Perseverance, which is Curiosity with improvements, will trundle around and they will start taking samples of all the interesting stuff, but they're not actually going to, they're going to then wait till 2028 for the next mission to land, the Mars sample return, which will be European. And then there'll be a rover on that, which will probably be built in Britain, that will have to establish the land speed record on Mars, or 2 or 3 times faster. We're not talking about Grand Prix. It needs to be able to go and grab up some of these samples. So Perseverance will land. It will take what they call caches, and they're sort of they're like sort of elongated test tubes, and they'll try and get a variety of these things that they can. Then in the meantime, the scientists can argue over which is the most relevant, and something like 20 or 30 of the most interesting will be packed into a ascent vehicle, as it's called, to bring back the sample of Mars. Now, the World Space Agencies have been talking about this for as long as I've been covering space. I always like to use the example of the villain in Live and Let Die, right, where he says, and paraphrasing, there's 2 ways to disarm a crocodile. You can either shoot it or you can stick your hand in and pull its teeth out, but one by one. And getting a sample back of Mars is sticking your hand in and taking each tooth out. You can't just be on the surface of Mars, take a sample, there's the Earth, whoomph, fire it back. There are lots and lots of really, really complicated stages that you've got to do, and the clock is running, because of the whole time you need to hit the launch window to come back to Earth. So I think they'll do it, but as we say in the book, don't believe some of the breezy hype. There's a lot of sort of technical problems that need to be solved. One of the reasons why, and I think quite sensibly, Europe has decided to delay ExoMars, which is landing at a different site, is because landing on Mars is tough. You need to make sure the technology is working and it's up to speed. And as we know, they've had a few problems, which by the next launch window they'll hopefully have fixed. But it's not easy. There was a headline that I really quite liked in something like Wired that said, "Most Mars missions crash, burn, or die."
Yeah, well, even Perseverance is going to have to go through that moment of terror, just like Curiosity did. The Americans have seemed to be nailing it, but of course, it's not over till the fat lady sings. Yeah, do you have a sort of personal hero that you would bring back from the grave? They have to be dead. That you would bring back from the grave and say, Look at all this! Isn't this amazing? So you would sort of show them and everything that we've learned about Mars and space. Who would you bring back?
With Mars, I would love to bring back Jerry Soffen, who was the Viking project scientist. He had the wisdom of Solomon because all the biologists bickered. That's not just a journalistic invention. There was it wasn't a happy ship. He was a really cool guy. If you ever see the pictures, and there's a picture of him in the book, he looks like a jazz musician. And I had the chance to talk to him, which was the most, amazing thing of all my career. That was in '96, and unfortunately he passed away. And then spoke to him again the following year. He passed away in 2000. He was thought when Viking landed, the chances of life would be 1 in 50. He was convinced from the Viking results that, maybe Mars. But I'd love to, if he could come back and just sit with him and go through all this stuff. I also had this very, very strange experience, which some of you listeners might appreciate. In 94, I was out for the Hubble fix, when they got to fix the problem with the mirror, and went to Washington to the American Astronomical Society, and they announced the results. So they announced the results, and everyone. It was in a corridor, and I thought it was at NASA Goddard because that's where Jerry Soffen worked. So I'm standing in a corridor, but it might not have been. And there's a doorway, and this door opens, and Jerry Soffen walks out. So I introduced myself and talked to him, and blah blah blah. Because by then he was working as the university liaison for NASA, based at Goddard. And then 5 minutes later, the door opens, and there was a retired astronomer, Nancy Roman, who she was, if you look on, recently, with the mother of Hubble. She was the first person who. And then 5 minutes after that, out of the same doorway, the astronaut John Young appeared. And to me, I always thought, the first scene in the Beatles' Help movie, where they all come out of the 4 front doors and they're all there must be a room where all these people live. And I'd like to think that somewhere up in, wherever their spirits went to, they're all sitting around looking at all this and thinking, wow.
That is 3 legends right there. It's funny that we've just spoke about Nancy Roman, of course, because they've just named the W1st telescope after her.
Ah, okay. Yeah. She was great because she just... she was head of astronomy at NASA headquarters, and in some sense sort of fought her corner against the people from JPL with their budgets. She was a very accomplished person. The other person is Vera Rubin, who I met, who there's a ridge in Gale Crater where Curiosity's landed that's been named after her. And her son is involved with one of the Curiosity teams. So even though I'm an old geezer looking back at, from the sort of pipe and slippers stage, I was very lucky to meet a lot of great people over the years. And
you've just mentioned like 4 of the mega rock stars that we've kind of mentioned a lot on the podcast. John Young's definitely one of my favourite ever.
John Young should have been the commander of the shuttle mission in '86 that would have launched Hubble then, but obviously Challenger blew up, and he didn't because the shuttle was delayed and Hubble wasn't launched until 1990, and I was there. I saw that. That was pretty nifty.
My God, yeah.
Whenever I see a picture of Columbia coming back on the first landing, so that was April the 14th, 1981, and the reason I remember, and it was about just after 7 o'clock here, at 6 o'clock that night I was in the garden and the phone rang, and my mum came out and said, with a voice that made me think that she thought it was a practical joke, but it wasn't. And this guy in Washington said, "Hi, we got your letter. We've arranged it for you. We've got you somewhere to stay and a summer job at JPL." So that was it. So I sort of looked at the phone and went, "Wow." So my claim to fame is that I am the youngest Brit to have worked, certainly for JPL, when I actually started on my 17th birthday in the summer of '81. So how about that? No
one is ever going to beat that.
There's an interesting thing, because I'll mention another great space hero who you'll like. Some of your listeners will know. That was Dick Feynman, but I'll come back to that. There were no kind of space camps. There was none of that in the 70s and 80s, or the early 80s anyway. And I just got it into my head because I really was a space nut. I didn't get out much. And I realised after I'd done my O-levels, or GCSEs or whatever they were, the following summer, 1981, Voyager 2 would fly past Saturn. So in another draft of a really bad Adam Sandler movie, I decided to get a summer job because the encounter was the end of August, and I thought in my youthful, I'm not quite sure wisdom or just sort of crass stupidity, but I decided that I wanted to go to JPL to witness Voyager 2 fly past Saturn. And by a series of bizarre accidents and sort of things that happened of the letters landing on the desks, this was arranged to me. And this was a guy at JPL called Al Hibbs, who, just look at his name, I've tweeted about him quite a lot. He was well known at that time as the voice of Voyager, and indeed the voice of Viking, because he was a scientist at JPL, and he could explain stuff, so he used to appear on television. So I knew who he was, and that was the most extraordinary thing I've ever done, and the greatest privilege I've ever had, that somebody who oddly enough is my age now, he was 54, 55, when this letter from this 16-year-old kid landed on his desk. And what I didn't realise, by the way, until much later, was he dealt with all the nutters. So if somebody wrote to NASA for a really weird, it would end up on his desk. But I'd written this very, very sensible letter to say, I want to be at JPL for Voyager 2, because there's two other things that people forget now. Reagan had come to power, and the Reaganomics, they wanted to lock back everything that wasn't shuttle related. And Voyager, it was odds on chance that it would survive Saturn, but there would be no money. Now, this is always something that's there in space exploration. Governments do these crackers things, but somehow Voyager, kept funding for peanuts that then went to Uranus and to Neptune. So that's my claim to fame. About 10 years ago, my cousin rang me and said there was some kid on the radio he's 16 and he's going to NASA. I said, right, what's his name? Find out where he lives and let's stop him. No, we didn't.
It would be very good if you had somehow conspired to...
That's why I turned to crime writing. I look back and pinch myself because I feel like I was the cabin boy on a journey of exploration and met all these great people, and went to JPL and did a bit of work. But one time, a friend of Al's called Eleanor Helene, who discovered most of the Earth-crossing asteroids in the early years, said to me, "Would you like to spend a night at Palomar?" That was a silly question when you're 17, so I spent a night on an observing run at Palomar. So I always felt that, because the plan was that I would go off and do research, but there was a fundamental flaw in that, is that I'm not nearly numerate enough. And my other sort of, the other thing that comes in from that is that I'm one of the few people who ever met Richard Feynman who was inspired not to do science. Perhaps I should explain. Al had been a student at Caltech, and Feynman was his supervisor. All the stranger for the fact that his PhD was in oceanography, was how the wind makes waves, and Feynman was a quantum physicist. But Feynman loved mysteries. So when Al came to him and said, "I'd like to look at this," Feynman said, "Great, let's do it." So that's how a quantum physicist supervised the PhD of a student into oceanography. And Al's claim to fame, which is quite extraordinary in itself, is when he was a student, he'd read about the story of the engineer who'd gone to Monte Carlo to make a load of money because he could work out the errors in roulette wheels. So he and his roommate, a guy called Roy Walford, went to Vegas and went to Reno and worked out the mathematics of how to make money on casinos. This is in 1947. They were 24 and they made the press at the time. And they didn't make vast amounts of money because it's the Monte Carlo method and all those sort of statistics didn't mean that you make it, but they made enough money and they bought a boat and sailed around the Caribbean. And then he was hired by JPL for one good reason: they believed his statistics. So when Explorer 1 was launched, he was the sort of chief mathematician. He was the systems analyst on it, and Explorer 1 is launched. At the top, it started spinning, and the 11 rockets that fired, and he had to work out the probability that they'd fired. This was a time when there's no radio tracking, so somebody in Tampa tracked it and said it looks like it's coming down in, I don't know, the North Atlantic. And he said, no, hold on, we'll get the signal. It's higher than we think it is. And it was something like, I forget, 15 or 20 miles higher than they thought, that altered the time when they got the first confirmation. So there's the famous picture of Van Allen, Pickering and von Braun holding up the satellite to say America's first satellite. That was after Al had phoned through. There was a guy waiting on the other side of the auditorium, thumbs up, yeah, you can announce it, we've picked it up. So by a very, very series of bizarre accidents, I write a letter that lands on his desk, and he arranges me to have a job there, and it was, quite possibly the most extraordinary experience I've ever really had. Not least because that same summer, he said, "Oh, my former PhD supervisor's coming over." At this point, I should point out that Feynman was well known, but he wasn't, scientific rock star. Not many people, outside of the world of physics, not many people knew who he was. So this guy turns up, and, this is Dick, and blah, blah, blah. And I'd got a vague notion of who he was, but I didn't realise who he was. I come home, a few weeks later, there's the famous Horizon that Chris Sykes made, where Feynman talks to the camera, and it's absolutely mesmerising. And I went back to California the following summer, and I suddenly realised, actually, I'm going to be, if I carry on doing this stuff, I'm fourth rate. I'm never going to be, the magician rock star that these guys are. But what I learned from them is you don't have to be. That took me quite a while to realise that everybody has some sort of skill that they can use. And anybody listening to this, if you're, doing your A-levels and the school asks you not to do chemistry like they did with me because they didn't want the average grades to be reduced, don't worry, you'll find something else to do.
Oh yeah, well, I'm a total believer, really, that talent doesn't exist. I mean, Richard Feynman's actually quite a good example of it. Apparently he never used to score very highly on IQ tests. And when you read about Feynman, it's just if you're interested and curious about a subject, you get good at it. You if you love it, you'll be good at it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. How about that? And that's it. And and I mean, let's be honest about it. They had this extraordinary ability to be able to see through to the fundamental questions. I mean, the most obvious was Challenger. He didn't really want to get involved. He always stayed away from Washington. He didn't want to do it. A former student of his who had then went to the Rand Corporation and ended up being the NASA administrator, William Graham, sort of pressurized him and said, you need to do this. And Dr. Feynman goes to Washington and in the famous way got to the heart of the problem, and the famous footage with the ice water and the O-ring to prove the problem. Now, as he said, he'd been prompted in that direction by one of the military guys on the commission, but he could see through stuff that other people didn't because of this extraordinary ability. And I knew at an early age I didn't have that, but what I didn't realise until reasonably comparatively recently is that most people, not everybody is a Nobel Prize winning rock star, and you don't have to be. Because in those days, if whereas everybody now is doing their own podcasts and got their YouTube channels and is doing SciComm and all this sort of stuff, nobody did that then. If you publicised science, that was you don't do that. Go and stand over there, away from the people doing the science, which always struck me as being stupid anyway. And they had this ability to explain things, and if there's one thing that I've hopefully been able to do, it's the same thing, is to understand something, not to the same degree of accuracy, but I could always look at something and think, I think I know how to explain that. And I don't think that's something that you can learn. I think you either have it. It's like being a blues singer. You've either got it or you haven't.
Yeah, to explain a complicated thing, but not just explain it, but make it interesting. Not to sort of say it in such a way that you don't feel as though you're grasping at the edges of it. You feel as though, oh yeah, no, I really get it. Even though you walk away and then you try and explain it to someone else and you go, oh no, I didn't understand it. But
we said this is quite interesting because whenever they had a lecture from Feynman, they could follow exactly his train of thought, and from this and this. So he goes away and looks at different problems and gets them to look at it in a different way. And afterwards, they'd be sort of sitting around thinking, "What do we learn?" It was they said the standard joke about Feynman was a lecture from Feynman is like a Chinese meal. An hour later, you're not sure what you've learned, and it was because his brain was so unique that he could look at things while he was talking. You could follow it, but you couldn't. There's no way that you could have the same thought processes on a problem. So, I think that's quite interesting. I'll send you the picture so you can put it on your site. There's one of the saddest things was Feynman died in. I always thought it was 89, but it was actually 88. And after he died, a year later, Gwyneth, his wife, who was from Halifax, he met her on a beach in Geneva, on Lake Geneva, when he'd been consulting at CERN. And she died, so Alan Marker, who were good friends of the Feynmans, kept the dog, Tara, who was a spotty dog with one brown eye and one blue eye. And I happened to be in Pasadena in 1990, around the launch of Hubble, and one night I was in the kind of TV room and put this... there was a VHS or the American equivalent, of one of the Feynman programs, and I put the program on, and it was basically Feynman just talking, and Tara, the dog, ran in with her eyes wide, because she obviously recognised the voice, and she came in looking to see where he was.
oh no.
Yeah.
Oh,
This is, for some reason, that always struck me. So not only did he have this great effect on human beings, a dog could, even a dog. So there you go.
The Interplanetary podcast is alive!
that is a small chunk of what turned out to be a 2-hour conversation. So I should be playing more of that fun chat in future episodes just before the book comes out.
I think I now need to go and buy some of his books.
Oh, big time. And maybe put down a pre-purchase on Amazon for his new book. Oh, Jamie, before we go, I wanted to mention just this one last story, which was that was doing the rounds on Twitter a little bit, because it's kind of silly. There's an experiment in the Antarctic called the Impulsive Transient Antenna, or ANITA. And that looks like a big, I don't know, it looks like a Function 1 rig that flies underneath a balloon. So like a big sort of point source PA system. Quite old-fashioned point source PA system flying under a balloon. But it's not actually, it's a neutrino detector.
Oh.
An ultra-high energy cosmic neutrino detector. That NASA fly in a helium balloon at about 37,000 meters high above the Antarctic, and it measures cosmic rays. But back in 2018, a chap called P.W. Gorham et al. Reported on a cosmic ray shower that, instead of coming into the Earth, was coming up from the ice. Whoa. And it was like, what the heck is going on? Like an upside down shower of cosmic rays. And there's been quite a lot of excitement about that since then. And I noticed in New Scientist and things like that, they're running the story at the moment that it's evidence for a possible alternate parallel universe.
Oh, here we go.
That's running backwards, where antimatter is the main matter and time flows backwards, etc., etc. And that this cosmic ray, upside down cosmic shower, is in fact evidence for this parallel universe.
My lord.
Now, yeah, I think that extraordinary results, of course, need extraordinary evidence.
You sound sceptical, Matt. It's weird.
Well, you've kind of, well, here's your choice, right? Here's your choice. It's either something slightly wrong with the experiment itself, i.e. there's some technical issue, a bit like that time where neutrinos were going faster than the speed of light, and then it turned out that it was a cable, hadn't quite been plugged in correctly.
That's right.
I think this is going to be something like that, especially considering just how stubborn the standard model is.
My word.
So, I don't know. I'm yet to be convinced that there is a parallel universe that we can see because there's an upside-down cosmic shower. But it's fun nevertheless.
It's fun, but so is Occam's razor. So let's see where we are.
Stick off Occam's razor in your beard.
Just saying.
Just saying. Jamie.
Yeah.
What are you doing for the rest of the week?
What am I doing? Lots of work, lots of Zoom meetings. I'm getting into riding a bike, but as you know, Matt, I've just ordered my new guitar, so I'm hoping
that is glory.
If that arrives before the weekend, I'll be shredding all weekend. You know,
excellent. Shred away.
We'll see what we can create.
Well, we've promised to do a Bowie cover, haven't we? We'll have to do a space-related Bowie cover and stick it at the end.
I'll tell you what,
of the podcast.
we should also work on a new couple of new jingles maybe for the show.
Oh yeah, big time. Big time.
See if we can up our production value.
Up our production value.
Matt, if somebody's enjoyed this show and they're quite new, maybe they've been recommended the poddy, where can they go to get more information and possibly join an elite club of patrons?
I should suggest that the main place to go is www.interplanetary.org.uk. This is where you'll find everything.
Excellent advice. And what are you up to this weekend, Matthew?
I shall be taking it easy after billions of hours of Zoom again. Yes. I'm as you know, I'm in the middle of a Queen covers project, I think I have been challenged by the patrons to do that Red Dwarf cover that you challenged me to. So I might do that.
Keep
this weekend.
promising it.
I might do that, but I've also got to do Death on Two Legs by Queen, which isn't going to be easy.
That is one of my faves. Death on Two Legs.
Yeah, I might do it in a kind of
never had a heart of your own.
New metal voice.
You'll suck my blood like a leech.
That kind of thing.
Oh dear.
Yeah, that's only because Arthur's trying to persuade me to do that because he's a big Trivium fan.
Of course he is.
Yeah, big time.
Big time.
Shall we let them go?
Yeah. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Bye-bye, Spodcats. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Ta-ta.
Ta-ta.